How much of the rainbow and unicorn fumes are still left? I mean, the politicians in all these countries like France and Britain and the United States, I mean, these people are all talking a really good game still with the high-minded moral sentiments. And Chang's message is kind of another way of saying maybe put your money where your mouth is, and answering a key question a lot of people who are wondering about supporting China have, which is, will they be around 5 minutes after real fighting starts? Is it worth my investment? Will there even be a Chinese army still around by the time the rifles that I buy for them get there? It's a legitimate question. People that are probably in the best position to answer this question, although they're probably biased, you would think, though, would be the Japanese military. After all, they've been fighting the Chinese now for years in this undeclared war, and they're apparently telling the emperor that they can get a handle on this Chinese problem. Just give them 3 months. So not exactly the highest opinion of Chinese military capabilities, but let's remember they've not seen a united China, nor have they seen a very defiant one up till now. They're getting both this time. But in an attempt to sort of answer these questions for, the global audience out there, Chiang Kai-shek and his generals choose a strategy, and it's got a lot of reasons why he chose it, but there's a lot of downsides too that will put everything that's going to happen, as much as China has an opportunity to do this anyway on the other side of the world from most of the great powers, it's going to put all these events front and center in front of the people whose opinion matters in this case, the people that can make loans, send arms, and maybe even launch embargoes on Japan, or maybe even bring in troops. I mean, the possibilities are endless if you can just get them interested. What if you expand the war to an area where they're already really interested? How about taking the war to Shanghai, where all those great powers have a lot of money invested, have commercial interest, have in most cases thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of their citizens living there as expatriates or workers? How about you just bring the war to Shanghai, where the entire global media will be there to witness it too? And what if you throw in a ton of your strength, that you've built up over the years and sort of safeguarded and kept for just such an occasion so that you can give a huge display of your capability to fight the Japanese when you want to? So what if you do all that? And if you trap these technologically superior, better trained, better coordinated, better supplied, better led, more experienced in many cases, Japanese troops, if you trap them in the narrow alleyways of a city, and Shanghai in its dense core is like a modern European city, stone, brick buildings, I mean, you trap somebody there, it could be, and this is a book title that I used for this by author Peter Harmson, Stalingrad on the Yangtze. Now, things like street fighting, that all falls into the tactical questions, obviously. If you zoom out here, though, and look at this from the strategic point of view, look at what Chang has done here. And as I said, it's a double-edged sword, but he's essentially sort of calling Japan's bluff in terms, I would say, of being a true great power, because there are several great powers that don't have the land mass or raw materials foundation, to put them in the very top class of great powers. There's nothing that Germany, for example, can do about that. They've tried the Lebensraum thing once before, but they make up for it with a lot of other things like the Japanese do. But the Chinese are legitimately huge. We're talking about land masses that, your Soviet Union type size things, although that was somewhat bigger, but United States type sizes. It gives them a luxury most places don't have, gives them the luxury of space. And if you are a battlefield general, space is, to say it's huge might be an understatement. It might be a determining factor. Think like a Russian general, for example. The Chinese will sometimes trade space for time, and one of the times will be here. But look at what they've done. I mean, if you look at a map, the Japanese are up in the north fighting, above Beijing and stuff. Shanghai is more than 600 miles to the south with intervening Chinese territory the whole way. The only way the Japanese are going to be able to fight is by using the Japanese Navy to ferry troops continually from other areas and land them in amphibious operations around Shanghai. They're going to have to create an ocean-going logistical supply line all the way back to Japan. That's more complicated and expensive than doing it with railways and supply lines on land. I mean, to get an idea of the distance here, in the book, The Battle for China, which each chapter is written by a different expert, historians Edward J. Drea and Hans van der Ven try to put it in U.S. terms, and they say that if you locate Beijing, which used to be called Peking back in this era, but if you locate Beijing up at Michigan's Upper Peninsula, that would put Shanghai over by Washington, D.C., Canton down by New Orleans, Wuhan, they write, would be where St. Louis is approximately, and Chongqing would be in southwestern Kansas. Imagine somebody landing on the East Coast and trying to conquer everything to the Mississippi. Now imagine it's a small island nation with about 70 to 80 million people that less than, 75 years ago was living under a military shogun and was closed to the Western world? China's going to call Japan's bluff here, right? How large are you? You want to play this game? You're beating us in single deck poker? How about we throw out 5 decks and see if you can still play? Of course, let's not forget the downsides of fighting in a place like Shanghai. I mean, if you're Chinese, Shanghai is your commercial capital too. If New York is your commercial capital, how much are you going to appreciate having a couple of mid-20th century armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands fighting it out anywhere in your city? What's that going to do to your industrial output? It's even stranger than that, though, and there's a certain dynamic when you get modern battles in big, big cities, and that's that you can have fighting raging in one part and yet total peace in another part. So imagine New York City has this fighting raging in a place like Queens or a borough like Brooklyn, but it's peaceful enough in Manhattan for you to take a date up to a skyscraper, have martinis, and watch over the balcony at the puffs of smoke in the distance where the fighting is raging. That'll happen in Shanghai too, where people will come out to watch. And don't kid me, New Yorkers, you'd have a lot of people coming out to watch. That's the other problem with deciding to have a battle in Shanghai, the people. If you have a city of 3 to 4 million people and they're going to start to fight a modern battle in the middle of it, what happens to them? Well, a mass exodus begins right as the fighting starts in Shanghai that will be the largest in the city's history and at times will reach stampede-like levels of panic. And you have to imagine, and all the books try to convey this, the sea of humanity in this city at this time. It's already a crowded city, and you have all these war refugees that have also poured into it. So it is jam-packed with the sea of humanity. Author Peter Harmsen in Shanghai, 1937, Stalingrad on the Yangtze, recalls one account from somebody who was caught on a bridge with a bunch of civilians trying to get from one perceived unsafe district in the city to a perceived safe one. Harmsen writes, quote, "For the foreigners of Shanghai, visitors and residents alike, the war was a rather violent diversion, but nothing truly dangerous, or so they thought. For the Chinese, life was falling apart. As the fighting intensified around the Japanese district, thousands of refugees fled through the streets, heading for Susao Creek and the Garden Bridge, which was the only link to the international settlement that remained open. It was a mad and merciless stampede where the weak had little chance." Now quoting a primary source, quote, "My feet were slipping in blood and flesh," recalled Rhodes Farmer, a journalist for the New China Daily News, who found himself in a sea of people struggling to leave Hongkou. Quote, "Half a dozen times I knew I was walking on the bodies of children or old people sucked under by the torrent, trampled flat by countless feet." End quote. Harmsen continues, quote, "Near the creek, the mass of sweating and panting humanity was almost beyond control as it funneled towards the bridge, which was a mere 55 feet wide. 2 Japanese sentries were nearly overwhelmed by the crowds and reacted the way that they had been taught, with immediate, reflexive brutality. One of them," he writes, "bayoneted an old man and threw the lifeless body into the filthy creek below. This did not deter any of the other refugees who kept pushing toward the bridge and what they believed to be the safety of the international settlement. They could not know it, but they were now moving in the wrong direction, towards the most horrific slaughter of innocent civilians of the entire Shanghai campaign." End quote. These refugees are trying desperately to get to the area they think is going to be the safe zone because they know that neither army wants to kill foreigners from great powers. And they know those foreigners stay in places like the French concession part of the city or the international settlement part of the city. So they're trying to get there. It's an already crowded, very nice part of town. And so as these refugees pour in, they're going to swell the numbers even more. Now, they're running away from the first real combat, which gets going August 13th, 1937, but it's more the strategic taking of places in preparation for the big attack. The big attack will come the next day, almost at exactly the same time Murphy's Law comes into play, Murphy's Law of urban warfare in dense population centers. And in an attempt to bomb Japanese warships in the river running through Shanghai, twice in 15 minutes, Chinese planes will instead release their bombs in places that kill lots of other people, innocent people, people from their own country. If you had wanted to design an experiment, maybe you're an arms manufacturer looking for data, and you wanted to give the maximum number of people, one bomb in a given situation could kill, you could not design probably a better testing ground to get positive results as you would see them in that situation than choosing this part of Shanghai at this time. I mean, an urban center with concrete everywhere, buildings on both sides, and people absolutely jam packed. They're extra jam packed here as well because they're watching. There are thousands upon thousands of people lined up on the boulevard watching these Chinese planes and cheering them on as they try to hit these Japanese ships in the river. So when these bombs go awry, the thousands of people watching actually, I mean, there's accounts, actually see them coming down at them. They had a split second to think about what was just about to happen. Here's what Peter Harmson writes, quote, "The two bombs released by the Chinese airplane had struck at exactly 4:27 p.m. The attacks stopped the arms of a clock at the entrance of Cathay Hotel.